feel it's the right tone for the type of conversation we will have. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Stephen Blockmans, as you would have seen. I'm not sure if I need to do the introductions yet again. You have just had them, but also in your program. I should maybe say up front, this panel called Recalibrating EU support to candidate countries in boosting their resilience to hedge against foreign interference, malign foreign interference, is conducted in the context of a Reunir project funded by the EU in cooperation with the BCSP. And so we're very grateful to them for having given us the platform to discuss some of the findings of our research. The debate will therefore primarily start from a collection of findings on the basis of field research, desk research, interviews, etc., focus groups that we've conducted throughout this region, but also the Eastern Neighborhood trio of candidate countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. There's a bit of an expiry date perhaps on those findings. They were conducted in spring of this year. Moods have shifted, of course, as a result of geopolitical changes, but nonetheless, they try and capture, and I think still quite well represent, feelings which were also espoused in the first panel for those who were able to join the geopolitical panel earlier in this room. What we are trying to do, however, is to see, to unleash ourselves from, a feeling of depression and self-pity, and see, which is as much prevalent, I think, in this region or candidate countries as it is in EU member states, to try and transcend that mood and see what can be done more constructively. That's ultimately what we're after. And our panelists have been asked to first share their observations from a threat scan and a resilience assessment, which we've conducted, in as academically justifiable a way as possible, to then have a second round whereby we go into prescriptive mode and trying to see what the European Union as a collective with its partners or individual member states or beyond those institutional structures can do better in order to support candidate countries on their way to EU membership. And doing that in three domains: the military, the socioeconomic, and democracy promotion, although we'll mix it up a little bit in those areas. So that's the aim. Perhaps Gergana, you could start with democracy promotion, which is the traditional foreign policy agenda, perhaps, that the EU has rolled out through its normative power and that has been touted so often, but seems on the wane.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll try to present, our findings on how foreign malign interference undermines democracy in the candidate countries in particular, but the problem is larger. So the mechanisms of, weakening democratic institutions and, undermining societal cohesion, these are things that we observe beyond the candidate countries. And in the context of the candidate countries, it's Russia that we point our finger at, because we haven't detected yet the kind of political interference from other external powers, such as China or countries beyond Russia and the neighborhood. Now, there's two channels through which this foreign malign interference manifests a threat to democracy. One is the institutional channel, and the other is the societal channel. So what can actors like Russia do through institutional means? This is mostly to support political actors that actually thrive on a pro-Russia agenda, on a pro-Russia narrative. Support them through at election times, that's a big thing, election interference, and helping them come to power, right? We've seen that in a few cases. because we see a coincidence between a pro-Russian agenda and an illiberal agenda. So very, very often, when you have actors in power that that are supported by Russia, they, once in power, they set in motion a process of democratic backsliding, you can call it. It can be, you know, erosion, democratic erosion, but in any case, there is some process that undermines the checks and balances of the political system. So that's one thing, and we've observed this across the board. And the other way through which this foreign malign interference manifests itself is through you know, trying to undermine our societal cohesion, right? Trying to divide our societies, right? Russia thrives on that. Here, the sort of the cyber dimension is very important, and everything digital that happens in the virtual space through, you know, controlling the narrative or presenting kind of a narrative that, you know, contests the very values that our political regimes are based on. And here the paradox is, of course, that Russia uses the openness of our democratic systems to undermine these very systems. And this is potentially, you know, even more dangerous, right? Why? In the candidate countries in particular, because, you know, we see that, you know, a lot of these societies, that they have cultural affinities with Russia, right? And the danger is that, you know, they may not see through a malign agenda behind Russia's tactics, Russia's policies. Now, how do our candidates fare in terms of, you know, do they have resilience, right, to withstand all of these, you know, pressures that they are experiencing? Now, one of the good things that we have observed is that the more countries are exposed to all of these malign interferences, the more resilient that they become. And here, you know, the best pupils in town, so to say, are Moldova and Ukraine, who have been on the front line of Russian disinformation, Russian manipulation for a very long time, and they have developed both institutional and societal resilience. And we can talk about later on what has worked, what are the instruments that have worked to come to a level where you know, they have, you know, developed that capacity to protect their democracies, to protect their political regimes. Now, where we see less of a success is in countries where, you know, the political parties in power are actually, you know, they thrive on a pro-Russia ticket, okay? And so this is the story of Georgia, where although we see a very high societal resilience to external threats, you know, the institutional channel is, so to say, blocked, right? Because the government doesn't want to see, you know, all of these, you know, troll farms spreading narratives, you know, from Russia, because they actually, it's in their favor. It's, you know, it skews the level playing field in their favor, in their favor. And of course, Serbia is another example here. In our categorization, it fares very low on institutional resilience to Russian interference, precisely because of that reason. So I think, Stephen, I'm going to stop here as a starter, and I am going to give the floor to my colleagues to continue the story on the other dimensions.
That's good. Thanks, Gergana. Can you just briefly say a word about the role that other actors, I mean, you singled out Russia, but there are many others. Obviously, you seem to disregard, you know, the role that China, Turkey, the UAE, or the US, or EU member states play in eroding democratic principles in candidate countries.
most of the research actually we've done shows that these other candidates, in particular China, they thrive on economic vulnerabilities of these countries. And so I expect actually the China story to come up in Fanny's intervention. But, you know, we haven't seen the kind of political interference from China that we see from Russia. And there was somebody yesterday also making the same statement that across Europe, not only in the candidate countries, that is less of a concern yet, right? That is less of a concern yet.
Okay, well, yeah, there is evidence, of course, of their boosting tactics to Russian interferences, but not primary actors. That's your point. So, yeah, I mean, that's a nice segue to Fanny on the socioeconomic front.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for having me here. On this socio-economic front, I guess what sets the stage for malign interference affecting candidate countries' resilience are the more systemic and structural economic vulnerabilities of the candidate country. So, you know, GDP growth that is more consumption-led than production-led, service-based economies, dependence on remittance from some of them, imports, as well as, you know, a lack of social safety nets, brain drain, etc. And these make even candidate countries that are considered to be front runners in terms of their work towards EU accession, make them more vulnerable to these threat actors and instruments. So as was just discussed, it's more than there's Russia, there's China, of course, some of the Gulf states, especially the UAE. You could also include, for the case of Kosovo, Serbia, because of the trade blockades, energy infrastructure manipulation, and also the fueling of division. So different threat actors use different instruments, which, you know, that has an impact on their likelihood on their those long-term risks. We basically have three broad categories for these threats, which are on the socio-economic front, which are economic, that includes foreign strategic investments in critical infrastructure, but also energy dependence, which is one of the really the biggest threats. Also migration and population influence, which is especially used by Russia in the Eastern Neighborhood 3, and fueling corruption, both political and financial. So we're looking at both the short-term high impact of you know, Russia's action in the Eastern Neighborhood, Serbia and Kosovo, and the long-term high impact of a lot of strategic investments in critical infrastructure. So as Gergana was saying, right now investments from China, Turkey, the UAE, etc., in telecom, energy, banking, and I'm probably forgetting a few sectors there, mean that on the longer term, we don't know whether these will be more exploited and possibly weaponized. Now, of course, in terms of the resilience assessment, since, you know, I don't have time, of course, to list. So if there's a differing sort of portrait of things, not only depending on the country, on the region, but also the type of threat. So, for example, Ukraine and Moldova becoming more resilient in terms of the energy dependence doesn't mean that they are actually resilient in terms of fueling corruption or other more immediate risks. You have countries such as Montenegro among the Western Balkans who are more vulnerable economically because of high reliance on tourism or remittance, but can be, you know, dynamic in other ways. So those top, you know, risks are also the ones that the EU is acting on with this toolbox. But I think that's maybe I keep some of this for later. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Fanny. Yeah. This is indeed the area also in the socio cultural field where other actors than Russia play a distinct role. I would like to, before I give maybe Antoine the floor, because you will try and cover different areas, maybe see a few words still on the defense military side of things, where the threats are obvious as far as the Eastern neighborhood countries in particular are concerned. Basically what we've done is create a sort of typology of 6 instruments ranging from destabilizing defense cooperation agreements between these foreign actors and individual candidate countries, through the use of military tools in hybrid warfare, to, of course, in the case of Ukraine, large-scale armed aggression. And there's several areas in between, occupying forces or military exercises that fall in those categories. And in the Western Balkans, it is Russia, again, that is the main hostile actor. It operates as a spoiler, primarily, sowing instability through all kinds of defense cooperative structures, training, arms transfers, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia. We can talk more about that. China's presence is, of course, there in the soft security sphere. You have CCP police offices in certain candidate countries and EU member states, I should add. But it is far less of a prevalent role there. Turkey promotes in parallel some replacement regional arrangements in the security sphere, which could not be ignored. They're centered around their own leadership, of course, which does not mesh well with the EU security agenda for candidate countries, and thus acts in a way as a spoiling power, even if it is in itself a candidate country. I should also note that Serbia, in particular, poses, in the view of several neighboring countries' elites and public institutions and representatives, a threat to their stability. I don't think I need to dwell on this. I should also say that the United States poses an increasing concern as a result of its capricious foreign policy. There are no indications as of yet what troop withdrawals or capacity withdrawals might mean, but this is certainly a risk that the EU will have to, and its partners will have to prepare for. Now, in terms of resilience, we've tried to, enhance our quantitative assessments, which are based on, all kinds of matrices and indices, with the qualitative data that we collected through the focus groups and in interviews. And from there, I think broadly speaking, it's a fair assessment to say that candidate countries lack the capacity to deal with both conventional and hybrid military threats to their security. I'm talking here hard security, primarily. Of course, Ukraine stands out as shining example of strong resilience against the military onslaught of Ukraine, but it has its own limitations, of course, and relies on foreign support. So cooperation with external actors is a very important factor to each of these candidate countries if they wish to not just bounce back to the status quo ante, but also keep on their membership track. In the second round, we can talk a little bit more about the EU policies that exist and their shortfalls and how they should be complemented. But perhaps here it's a logical segue to Antoine, who's not from the project, the research project, but from the cellule, stratégique of Quai d'Orsay, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France. It's longer than that, indeed. But so you may want to reflect on all three areas. Antoine.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to BCSP for having me. Indeed, just a quick precision that you already noted. And since this is a public session, I will be speaking as a policy planner, not as an official spokesperson for the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And my intervention will indeed dwell a bit onto the three sectors that we mentioned earlier, and will largely echo what the EU ambassador actually said yesterday, in the sense that enlargement is making a concrete choice, joining a community that defends the continent. So I'll be speaking of three sectors that need to be better taken into account when talking of malign interference in candidate countries in the framework of EU enlargement. The first one is economic security. The EU, after some time, has realized after the first Trump mandate and Chinese coercive measures that it's needed to develop a more comprehensive economic security strategy, which is built around three pillars: protection, promotion, and partnership. It is now developing a doctrine, and for this doctrine to be fully operational, it must absolutely extend to EU candidate countries. And the economic security agenda should be a pillar of the enlargement process. I'm not thinking of adding more criteria to the very long list of criteria that there is, but the thing is that candidate countries are already very connected with the single market, and with the gradual integration that will be put into place in several of them, they will be gradually members of the single market. And so as such, they have a responsibility, and the EU has a responsibility to help them in not weakening the single market. And this would inevitably happen if their critical infrastructures, such as transport infrastructures, ports, communication infrastructures, their research centers, or their energy sectors and other strategic assets were to become the property of third countries, especially through investments that would have otherwise been screened if these countries were already EU member states. The second sector is the defense sector. And this is particularly valid for non-NATO members and non-NATO candidate countries. And of course, as we mentioned, Stephen, Ukraine is a completely different case than other candidate countries. And again, here is the same idea. By strengthening the defense sector for candidate countries, we are actually solidifying the EU defense sector tomorrow, of course, but also today. Because whether we like it or not, the EU is gaining competences in the defense sector, and sadly, I don't see it becoming less pregnant in the years to come. So there's a few things that, in my view, we need to develop. The first thing is obviously integrating the industrial bases at all levels. So big projects from big groups, but also at the lower level. I'm thinking of SMEs, I'm thinking of startups, I'm thinking of every type of company. And this should happen through developing common projects. There's a lot of EU instruments that exist on that topic now. And it is essential that both candidate countries and EU member states actually take this opportunity and build the future EU industrial defense space. And the defense sector is a bit tricky when it comes to enlargement, because the EU Commission, of course, has no real competence when it comes to defense. But we could consider screening dependencies through other mechanisms. A few ideas could be for the industrial bases and companies in candidate countries to mobilize the European defense agencies, or groupings of small member states that could present a report at the same time that the Commission presents its yearly enlargement report to the Council, and that it could be taken into account in the reflection on the progress of candidate countries. On the same logic, there could be a screening by the same actors, member states, of military organizations and common structures, because the idea is obviously that we're building a common military structure at the EU level after, again, particularly for non-NATO countries. And so this should start now, because the threat is real, is coming, and we don't really have the time to wait for candidate countries to access before actually digging into that aspect. The third sector is FEMI, which is already largely covered by the EU and by EU policies and candidate country and member state policies toward candidate countries. But the Commission just released a proposition for what's called a democracy shield, and this is a new opportunity. This proposition contains the idea of building a European Center for Democratic Resilience, and it should, and it's already in the process actually, work very closely in and with candidate countries. To me, this center should help set up capabilities in candidate countries that don't already have some. Of course, again, as you mentioned, Ukraine and Moldova are very particular cases, and actually everyone, including a lot of EU member states, should learn from them rather than try and share their expertise. And regardless of the format of the institutions, and we can come back to the topic after, but in France we have an agency, other countries have the capabilities at the intelligence level, armed forces ministries, interior ministries, whatever. The idea is that FEMI should be monitored by candidate countries, or should they wish not to do so themselves. One idea could be to externalize this assessment to this center, which will work closely with the EAS, which has detection and analysis capabilities already. And the third pillar of the democracy shield is obviously to strengthen societal resilience, which you spoke very well about, and citizen engagement. And obviously this is, I don't need to underline how key this is in a lot of candidate countries, and the need for urgent action. So in the three sectors, and I'll conclude, you will see that I'm trying to show the same logic. Candidate countries' security is EU security, and it is already EU security today, even before they become member states. And so everyone should consider it as such and act as such, and we'll come into more detailed recommendations, but this is valid, of course, for EU institutions. This is also valid for member states. Some of them don't realize yet that their security is at play in candidate countries, but this is also valid for candidate countries, which need to realize that they are already somehow members of the community, and that they will be full members one day, and so that they need to act accordingly. Thank you.
Thanks, Antoine. And it's refreshing to hear that from a French perspective, even if it may be quasi-official, as you try to kind of hedge in your opening remarks. But that's very helpful to know. And indeed, I mean, security on all levels is inextricably linked, of course, between the EU and the candidate countries. So, quickly then, into prescriptive mode, building on what you've heard also from Antoine.
On how to build democratic resilience. So there's two elements to it. One is the institutional resilience, and the other one is the societal resilience. Now, the institutional resilience is the easy part. If you have a government in power, that's actually a pro-democracy government. If it's not a pro-democracy government, then you have a problem, right? Because even if you create the most advanced institutional and regulatory frameworks, if the government doesn't want to use it, you're going nowhere. And this is particularly the case of Serbia, right? This is our case study where you see, on paper, the institutional resilience of Serbia should be very high, right? But in practice it isn't, right? Because the government doesn't want to use these instruments. And, to the extent that a lot of these foreign malign interference is criminal activity, right? You have the means to actually trace it and to make a strong case, right? Even if it goes to court, even, to present solid evidence that, this is something that affects national security. But, you have to really be very strong on the evidence side of it, because if you're not,
and you're banning a political party like they did in Moldova, or like they did in Romania, then there's always the danger that, you know, you're undermining democracy yourself, right? So that, you know, that's the dilemma here, the tricky thing, that you really have to be very strong on tracing that. And it's not only a government business, this tracing, it's also business of the society. In the Moldovan case, which is the most recent one and which is a positive example of how to do things here and whom to learn from, this was not only a government affair, but the whole of society was involved. There were the journalists, the whistleblowers, there were the IT techs. I mean, everyone was kind of involved in it. And this is the second message, right? You have to do it together, right? Both at the level of the country, but also with your international partners. And I think the EU has been very, very important in the Moldovan case. Now, on the societal resilience business, that's a bit trickier. And that's something for both the governments and for the EU. And the EU in particular is known to be a very poor public communicator. And I don't understand why, because I think the EU, especially in the candidate countries, right, the EU underestimates that it is still a popular actor. I mean, even in Serbia, okay, it's 33%, we heard yesterday, but this is a third of the society. Okay, so there are pockets of society everywhere that, you know, are receptive of the EU narrative. And I think the EU has to be much more confident and much more comfortable, you know, defending its story. Right, and coming up with these positive arguments of why it is a good project and how everyone benefits. And you know, I'm saying this, but I'm not very optimistic that the EU will actually do that because the track record is so poor. And I'll stop here, Stephen.
Thanks, and I'm sure there will be questions on the democracy shield that would try and, you know, bridge the gap between early initiatives and implementation in the sense that Gergana suggested. Fanny, on the socioeconomic.
Right. So I'm going to jump from the EU narrative to, you know, the single market, which is, you know, can be talked about as passionately, I'm sure, because opening the single market has often been seen as and removing trade and non-trade barriers. Tariff and non-tariff barriers has been, you know, a long-term way for the EU to improve the socio-economic resilience of candidate countries, but there are some shortfalls to this, as in the benefits of that are not necessarily fully used due to weak institutions, as well as limited regional integration. And one of the more successful resilience-building mechanisms have been more in response to crisis. So you can think about the emergency MFAs, solidarity lanes, and autonomous trade measures with Ukraine, as well as the synchronization, the ENSOE synchronization to reduce energy dependence on Russia for Ukraine and Moldova. So these are good measures, and at the same time, it shows the EU's resilience toolbox as more reactive, rather than, you know, thought through in advance, not necessarily incentivizing structural reforms. There are also concerns about the under-absorption of EU funds, all these efforts towards the countries. So in terms of recommendation, one of the key would be to build long-term economic resilience in the countries, you know, to improve safety nets, support the economies, including SMEs, look at solutions to solve the brain drain, etc. There's also, that's long-term, of course, maybe on the slightly shorter terms, to improve the access of EU loans in the countries, you know, access to sustainable finance so that the countries don't have to rely on China or all Gulf countries. And of course, for these investments to enforce the procurement rules that have been agreed on and you know, avoid the opaque deals that are going on with more threatening actors. I think another important one would be to, I think these are from the findings of the project, to uphold the conditionality of these supports. There are a number of other recommendations, but I think these are the key ones.
That's good. And if the EU can't pull its weight in the economic dimension, then we can only hope for the best in democracy promotion and hard security provision. Just a couple of words on the latter. The EU is not famously known for its military muscle, but it has, of course, been propelled into this area much more in 2022, and is at the gym, basically, at the moment. There are two ways in which security and defense is channeled to and with Canada countries. One would be the traditional pre-accession process, where it is very limited. Of course, the idea would then be to beef up, in particular in Chapter 31 of the accession negotiations, with concrete benchmarks for all Canada countries, and not just the facilities which have been created for Ukraine, which of course is interesting from an EU point of view in boosting its own resilience, the EU's resilience, but to open that up for all Canada countries. And the second avenue is, of course, what we've seen in this proliferation of defense partnerships, currently only with Albania, North Macedonia, and Moldova, which foresee a broader bilateral type of defense cooperation between the European Union and those individual states, which arguably could then be regionalized as well. But as tools of integration, I think also locking in Canada countries and allowing their defense industries, to the extent that they exist, in this country there is one, to integrate much more with those segments of the single market that are being beefed up with seed money that is available through all kinds of new financial instruments. And then thirdly, there would be the tools of intervention of the European Union. There are the traditional CSDP missions and operations, which are understaffed, under-resourced in all kinds of ways. So their mandates are not very potent. There are positive examples, although we've heard also criticism earlier this morning about EU4 in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which nevertheless, after doubling its staff, did create apparently a sort of deterrent effect on malign interference of the sort that I've mentioned before. There is, of course, a military assistance mission to Ukraine. The European Peace Facility has been a vehicle through which to compensate member states for their lethal aids towards Ukraine, even though it's been stunted now as a result of Hungarian blockage for more than a year. But there too, in tools of intervention, there would be an appeal to the European Union to actually be more, to beef up its presence, its security presence in the region. So, with that, you have been given a lot of ammunition, so to speak, in 3 different domains, where through this project we try and systematize the threats across policy areas, trying to differentiate, of course, not just regionally between Canada country groupings, but also within those Canada groupings, and the foreign interference, which is disrupting, spoiling the membership enlargement tracks. And you have heard ideas, generic at the moment, but would be keen, to delve into some of them and elaborate more if you have any questions on issues that have piqued your interest. So we have about half an hour for discussion. So I open the floor for anyone who would like to raise a point at this stage. Try and catch my eye. Sir, please introduce yourself briefly as well.
Yes, good afternoon everyone. Pierluigi Nicchio from Italian Association of Energy Economics and volunteer at the UNECE. My question, because picking up on what Fanny said about the interactions between China and the region, is not only about soft power, but also the most recent first military drills held in China between Serbia and China itself. So maybe to everyone, this could be a good question on how is this broadening the gap between Serbia and the EU, because Brussels has, and also the United States have shown their condemnation towards this, and what could be done at the policy making level to provide with a better framework in order to edge against this kind of military alliances that are probably detrimental to the stability of the region, please. Thank you.
That might be more an issue for me than for Fanny, although there is perhaps an overlap. Anyone else? Sorry, I missed it. Who wanted to come in? In that corner, someone? Yes, please.
So I'm Laura from the Danish Embassy, and I was also wondering, maybe it's not so specific to your study, but I was just wondering to take your opinion on something. So regarding this malign interference in the energy sector, now there has been the American sanctions against Nice and also against Lukoil, and I was just wondering if you guys have a take on the perspective on the society and the public. Is it who is perceived as the bad guy, the malign influence? Is it Russia for actually making this or keeping this dependency, or is it the US for putting the sanctions, or is EU then the good guy for trying to help out? Or do you have a picture of how this is spinned in the public and society?
Yeah, I feel this will not be a question that can be solely answered from this panel, and we will have to rely also on the Serbian members of this audience. Who else? Elena.
Yeah, I wanted to pose a question, but maybe I can also comment on this. I am Jelena from the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, so we're participating in the project. But what I wanted to ask regarding the defense cooperation, I mean, it has been talked now a lot as a way to promote the region in the EU, like to push member states to be in favor of enlarging, so that the industrial capacities, defense industry capacities that, for example, Bosnia and Serbia have, especially, and defense was mentioned as one of the areas for this gradual integration, I think also now in the enlargement package. How can this help enlargement of the Western Balkans? Because I am afraid, you know, we are so used to, especially in Serbia with our government, they're going to use every resource they have to buy support for their own regime, while the rule of law suffers. So will this defense industrial capacities, for example, that Serbia or Bosnia have help them on their enlargement process, and will that affect, will that reintroduce the stabilitocracy approach of the EU?
Yeah. Thanks, Jelena. Very interesting question. Anyone else for this round? Yes, sir.
My name is Resha Trubanja, coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I'll echo what Jelena said, and I would also agree with many of the things that I've heard from the panel. But especially when it comes to the malign influences, if we're talking Bosnia and Herzegovina suffers most from the neighbors. That's a fact. And in particular, Serbia is usually blamed as being one of the obvious ones, but the Croatia is being a very kind of a silent partner in the crime that's not being mentioned as being a part of the EU, and I would like you to reflect on that, if possible. Thank you.
Yes, a pertinent point. Some self-reflection here from the EU side. Okay, we'll take this as a first round. Maybe others can, I see another hand up, come in the second round. Shall we go in the same order?
Yeah.
I mean, the last question could be relevant to yours.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the first question on Serbia, China, EU, the West. I think Serbian foreign policy at the moment is a classical example, a textbook example of what we call hedging in foreign policy. It has different names, right? Multi-vector foreign policy, right? It's you in the middle, you try to exercise some kind of sovereignty agency and you try to get benefits from all of these bigger powers around you. That's what Ukraine was doing up to a point, and it had to stop, right? And you know, who stopped that? The society in Ukraine, right? The society in Ukraine said, no, we are not going to Russia, right? We want a firm relationship with the European Union in all domains. And I think this is probably what will happen in Serbia. But at one point, I think this will have to stop, right? If the accession process is to proceed, and the ambassador was very clear about this, right? Brussels is getting increasingly nervous about this, right? And it's getting less tolerant of all of this. And, you know, although formally, and Stephen, you have to correct me here, CFSP alignment is not a precondition, right? The expectation is that actually you have to align with CFSP declarations, okay? Obviously, you know, this military cooperation goes beyond the CFSP declaration, but, you know, it's the same problem. So I think this will be perhaps resolved once the democracy question is resolved in Serbia. That's my bet here, of course, but I don't know.
Can I maybe just add one thought? I'll be much blunter. I know that diplomatically this is a hard sell, but essentially the game is Russia is an enemy. We're at war. We're not saying this, but we're at war with Russia. If you're in cahoots with Russia, you're against us. With us or against us. I mean, that's the subtext, at least, which would have to be formulated a bit more diplomatically, I understand.
Thank you, Steve. On the energy sections on Lukoil and NIS, I don't know the Serbian story, but I come from a country, you know, Bulgaria, where this is an issue as well. And I can tell you from the perspective of Bulgaria, it's too early to say. Yeah, it's too early to say who will be to blame, because we have, I mean, especially in the Bulgarian case, the sanctions have been postponed for the time being, so we haven't seen a price hike. So we don't know how the society is going to react, but I already see the temptation in the illiberal camp to try to blame it on the US and on the EU in particular. Yes, please.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Do the public know that the sanctions are going on, or like about to come? Do normal people know, or is it just the political elite who knows this?
Yes, they do know. It's
and Serjan would like to...
It's a major one question.
No, just to add, Gergana, yesterday your former Prime Minister, Kirill Petkov, was talking a lot about that at that panel, actually, comparing the two situations. And it seems really like what he was saying about Bulgaria is sort of an allegory on Serbia, in fact. You know.
Is that... No, I was just wondering whether that satisfies your desire for an answer. Yeah, Yelena?
Well, just to clarify, I mean, we did have, as Stephen mentioned, focus groups with citizens and experts, but that was in spring this year. At that time, the sanctions had been postponed in Serbia, so that has not come to effect. We would have to do new research to really precisely answer your question, but my perspective, I mean, from Serbia, I think this is a very salient issue in the public. The government perhaps tries to circumvent it by some other affairs. For us, it shows the incapability of the government and the tragic consequences of its balancing policy. But what the public sees can be different because the public and public opinion is largely created by the ruling party through its own pro-regime media. So without free media, they can control the narrative and they can put the blame on whoever they want. And at some point, even the EU was blamed, although it is not at all. In the picture, they were fake news that the EU has also sanctioned Serbia. And luckily, it was corrected also by the EU delegation to Serbia. And then we go back to what Gergana already has mentioned, and that is who controls the narrative. And of course that the EU, we have seen some steps. You have heard perhaps yesterday the keynote speech by the head of EU delegation to be more strict on Serbia, to be more direct on what's happening, but the EU definitely has to boost its communication efforts.
Okay, thanks. Fanny.
Thank you. Just to draw a small parallel between the Serbia-China military cooperation and an actor I'm familiar with, the DPRK or North Korea, which has had some involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war as well, and also what Stephen said about with us or against us. So the EU used to be quite more popular than other actors towards a very specific actor that is North Korea. This image of an honest broker with socio-economic support. But as soon as the EU, criticized, condemned North Korea's, involvement in the war, then the EU also became the enemy. But it's a choice the EU has made, and we have lost then this partnership with the DPRK, but I think the EU can expect more from its candidate countries than from North Korea. So does that point make sense? As in, there should be so many more ways to hold these candidate countries accountable than they are to hold the DPRK accountable in all its, relative irrationality and unpredictability.
Okay. Antoine.
Yes, I think the EU should expect more from candidate countries than from DPRK. But I fully agree with you. There should be ways. And that's why this is something to consider as part of the enlargement process, because it's Commission-led. Commission cannot do that. I will not repeat myself, but there must be a way to take this kind of drills, or as you were saying, hedging, into account in the enlargement process. Candidate countries will eventually have to make a definite choice. You cannot go eternally like this, but the choice must happen actually before entering the EU, because the kind of security drills or cooperation is just not possible. Aligning with CFSP statements and declarations is, of course, very important because it's symbolic and so on. But throwing security drills and cooperating industrially with malign actors that concretely say that they do not want the EU's well-being is much more important. And we must find a way to take it into account. One of the ways could be, obviously, and Fanny, you were mentioning that conditionality was praised, and I think there are a lot of ways that we could that we could use in a lot of sectors, and we should be able to use conditionality in the defense sectors in such a scenario. And on the question of on your question, Jelena, initial question, I think we have somehow to trust the enlargement process in the sense that fundamentals will remain fundamentals, and that there will not be any entry into the EU if fundamentals are not met. That is quite clear. And so while we are in this gray zone currently, the idea is obviously to keep the fundamentals at the head of the enlargement process, and I don't see defense cooperation, industrial cooperation surpassing, despite the geopolitical moment that the EU is going through, surpassing fundamentals. This is, well, this to me out of question.
Not even France.
It is a merit-based process.
That was official.
I was just wondering whether we're back in the Wandel durch Handel type of philosophy that Germany has, whereby trade and cooperation in the industrial sphere and the economic sphere will actually promote fundamental rights. I would hope here, and I think I'm siding with Antoine on this, that ultimately these forms of gradual integration, which I criticized a bit yesterday for being quite narrow and siloed, accelerated pathways into the single market, should be linked to fundamental conditionality. But that is exactly where currently the problem lies, because the European Commission hasn't made the linkage between the traditional application of Copenhagen criteria in the pre-accession process, the formal negotiation process, and the conditionality, which is price tagged, budget conditionality, basically on a gradual integration format. So these two need to be merged. That was the plea that I was making yesterday. And then I think, the Wandel durch Handel philosophy might actually stand a chance through the enlargement process. I have a question also for Antoine. You referred to the democracy shield, an initiative which needs to be fleshed out. We understand. Institutionally, there seems to be quite a duplication to what already exists. There is EU, the Stratcom, East Task Force, I think Western Balkans, or I'm not sure about the terminology or the labeling of these institutions, but isn't this exactly what the European External Action Service is supposed to do, and what the European Commission is now bringing into its own fold? Or am I seeing there too much institutional rivalry? I don't want to make this too much of a Brussels-based conversation, but it's maybe something that is worth pointing to.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Stephen. There is absolutely no competition between the EAS and the Commission. But more seriously, the idea of the Democracy Shield is to coordinate every tool. And also, so the EAS, from my understanding, and again, it will be discussed in the Council and so on, but my understanding is that the EAS will keep its competences regarding external, outside of the EU, but there is fundamentally a need to look at what's happening inside the EU, and again, personal position, but I think it is a very nice opportunity and a nice move by the Commission to look at what's happening inside the EU, because member states have very different systems. We heard yesterday from an Italian speaker that Italy is actually only now coming to realize the threat FIMI and hybrid, more globally hybrid threats represent. Some countries, of course, Baltic countries and countries more exposed to Russian hybrid attacks, have realized this before. But there is the EU is such an integrated community that there is a need for a supranational look at what is happening globally and also cross-border, because obviously, we can see the same when we're talking about, for instance, Russian interference networks, trolls, whatever you name them. They're obviously transnational, and looking at them only from a national perspective makes no sense in the bigger picture. So, I'm of course not saying that we should replace every national institution. National institutions are very important. They are coordinated by the EAS, but I think it's good that the Commission also has, in great coordination with member states and the EAS, a global look at what's happening inside the EU.
Yeah, that global look would start in the Canada countries neighboring the European Union, which have a lesson or two to teach to the European Union. Moldova was mentioned in countering FIMI. Ukraine as a security provider. So it seems in certain areas of EU activity, the flow is reversed in the favor of candidate countries, so as to serve a mutual strategic interest in different areas. Sir, you've been waiting patiently, and I appeal to others who want to come into the second round.
Yeah, I guess this works. Slađan Rankić from Konrad Adenauer Foundation. So it's a bit of a longer question, but I would like to play out what happens if this government acquiesces to this vertical integration of defense industry, and there's a lot of screening and dependency checking and screening. So what the problem is here, this government has one of the key criticisms levied against it by the opposition, the current protest, is that it is a multi-colony. So it's subservient to multiple colonial overlords, one of them which is the EU. And this narrative has been spreading widely after the Rio Tinto protests, 2021, I guess. So if the government, as it stands, begins vertical integration into the EU defense industrial space without accession, wouldn't that reinforce its image as a neo-colony of the EU and then produce democratic oppositional backlash against the government and by extension the EU? So we haven't spoken about the topic, which is fundamental, the issue of sovereignty. And if the candidate country is perceived or its government is not being sovereign enough and subservient to external powers, one of which is the EU, will it produce societal backlash to the government and to the EU by extension? And how do you counter that? So,
I'm sure Gergana and Antoine will have answers for you. But first...
Yeah. Konstantin Borodiev, German Federal Foreign Office, covering the enlargement file at our headquarters. I'd just like to make brief 2 short comments and 1 question to the panelists and also to our Serbian colleagues. First comment, if we want anything similar to Wandel durch Handel, it definitely needs a rebranding. It terribly failed. Secondly, on CFSP alignment, I mean, you're right, it's not like a concrete, semantically speaking, a concrete closing benchmark in the accession process, but it's, of course, an expectation because it's about making a strategic choice, right? It's not a numbers game if you have 50% or 60%. It doesn't matter, to be frankly speaking, if you change your stance on the UN resolution on Venezuela, but if you fully align with the CFSP, and I think that's the expectation in the Council. And so my question would be, you've mentioned some measures of gradual integration already. There's also new instruments like the growth plan for the Western Balkans, the Ukraine facility, the reform and growth facility for Moldova. So to you panelists, but also to our Serbian colleagues, do you think these instruments, although quite young, I will understand, are helpful in countering malign interference, also by making maybe the EU more appealing, and also maybe some projects which are currently being discussed or already implemented, like SEPA, Horizon Plus, Horizon or Erasmus Plus? I'd be interested in your views. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Well, Horizon is alive and well. We have a cooperation which is vivid here with many partners actually in Canada countries. Anyone else before I close? Yeah, Sergio.
I was refraining myself as a host to monopolize the discussion, but I just wanted to add to Antoine, because we on something that you said, we actually screen a lot of the panels in the first 2 days were transmitted live on N1. It's an independent television station here. So I was thinking, as I was listening to you, it would be immensely interesting if that was the case with this panel as well, and to tell you how the Serbian population would actually understand the exchange that you had with Jelena on defense cooperation, because in fact, you rightly pointed out, well, but we have the fundamentals, you know, and the fact that Serbia is cooperating, or Bosnia for that matter, on defense-related issues would not change that. You know, there would not be a free lunch on the fundamentals. However, you would be understood by an average Serb as actually saying, we don't want you in the EU. because for the last 13 years, this government has been using the whole debate about the fundamentals to present it as something, you know, that like basically an insurmountable obstacle, and that it's not their fault, it's the fault of the EU that puts all the time these conditions that are unreasonable, obviously quoting the example of North Macedonia, and we have been discussing about it quite a lot on the panels yesterday. So it would be interesting, actually, how do we communicate this properly? So I think communication is of fundamental importance there, you know, and I must say this is not necessarily the topic of the discussion here, but you know, why we decided in part to give to Irena Joveva the Lighthouse Award is because she's worth 10,000 EU za tebe, EU for you billboards. You know, every word that she utters is worth more than the actual, you know, public diplomacy of the EU that sounds like paid content, if you know what I mean, you know. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Can we go in reverse order, maybe, Antoine, since this was directed to you as well?
That I'm grateful that the panel was not broadcasted live, and thank you for pointing it out, because we can cooperate as much as we want, we can integrate as much as we want, and this is the idea of the enlargement process. One thing that that will never change, indeed, is the fundamentals aspect, and I do want Serbia inside the EU. I just don't want a non-democratic Serbia inside the EU. And cooperating on integrating the single market, taking the EU acquis, gradual integration in some sectors, energy, industry, and so on. That is very important, but the limits, and this is why I really insist on conditionality as fundamentals. That is a non-starter. Maybe to the question, and I hope that answers a bit the question of potential democratic backlash, because if, let's say that Serbia, or as other candidate countries have already done, integrates way more than it is the case today in the energy sector. And we talked about Moldova, for instance, talked about Ukraine, which joined the EU grids. Moldova, that went from complete dependency to complete independency to Russian energy. We're not discussing potential democratic backlash or empowering of a government, regardless of what the government is doing. So, what I'm saying is defense is important in the moment we're living, but energy is key and economic security is key. I'm saying everything is kind of key. So my main point was to treat the defense sector as one of the other sectors of the enlargement process, which it isn't today for institutional reasons, historic reasons, whatever. But to treat it as such, not more, not less. And so fundamentals will remain above everything else, and then, yes, there are some key sectors: energy, defense, others.
Thanks, Antoine. Gergana.
I mean, I could just say a few words about the new colonial comment. Now, you know, coming from Eastern Europe, you know, we know what an imperial policy looks like, okay? And, you know, Ukrainians know it very well today, but all of our countries have experienced it, you know, in our recent history and not so recent history. So there's no way we don't know what an imperial actor is, okay? And when I look at the EU, I don't recognize imperialism. Okay, of that form. Why? Because, you know, there's an element of choice there, right? And because the EU insists on the fundamentals, right? It's a democracy in the end. And, you know, if you don't want, right, the EU, the EU will not sanction you, right? You are welcome to stay outside.
And so that fundamental choice you don't have with an imperial actor like Russia, for example, today, that comes and says, you are Russian and you're not what you feel you are, you don't have a right to a state. You know, that's imperialism in its pure form. And if you compare it to the EU integration project, there's quite a bit of choice there, right, which, you know, make it further away. Now, I'm not saying there's no hegemony in this. Right? I'm not saying there's no hegemony in this. The EU is the strong actor here, and you know the candidate countries are on the receiving part, but there is an element of agency that you can exercise even if you come from that part of Europe. Okay. I don't want to give a lecture, no?
No, it's fine. And Brexit shows that you can unleash yourself from the claws of European integration somewhat. Fanny.
Thank you. Maybe a minute to talk about these, you know, growth plans, investment facilities that are also part of the EU's big global connectivity and investment offers. So I think from what we've heard from candidate countries, and maybe people in the room can let us know, you know, people are happy to receive foreign direct investment. It's good for business. At the same time, on the EU side, maybe the EU needs to work on involving its private sector more, and I just don't mean only big European multinationals who have access already to these markets and can be more or less promised big contracts. There's some issues about having enough businesses, smaller businesses and medium businesses interested in going into business delegations to candidate countries, so maybe fostering that fabric. But also maybe more on this debate on conditionality, neocolonialism, etc. So among our recommendations would be to apply this conditionality, to apply the EU's own due diligence standards, because in some agreements it has for investment, you know, some MOUs, you know which ones I'm referring to. MOUs are political agreements that don't necessarily have the same due diligence processes, impact studies, etc. So on the one hand, by having investment, you know, more political, non-binding agreement, the EU can say, look, we're not being super neo-colonial because we are looking directly at your own economic interests. Whereas when it goes more, with more emphasis on due diligence, respecting its own values, etc., it can be interpreted as a lesson giver. You know, it's the old style EU, oh, here they are again with their, you know, big administrative burdens, etc. So there's this balance to pay attention to respect that due diligence and at the same time and not have this neo-colonial approach.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, for me, it was an eye-opener going around the region this spring to see how, you know, the sweetheart deals, the MOUs with the UAE are really proliferating across the region. And that's just one actor. There are others too. Maybe one specific point still on any early lessons to be learned from the gradual integration mechanisms. I mean, CEPA has been opened for 4 candidate countries only on the 16th of October. If there's any journalists in the room, I think you have a task to do, and that is to investigate, and that is to investigate what 1 month's worth of implementation of the CEPA arrangement means in the pockets of people who are transferring remittances or indeed, you know, funds to pay for their sons and daughters at university in the European Union. The idea was that this would translate into a cut per transfer of around 40 euros. That's substantial for, you know, any type of household. And a welcome saving in a way. But what happens if the banks introduce new fees, transaction fees, and that gets cancelled out? Then obviously, you know, the gradual integration mechanism flops. So that's why I'm saying if there's any journalists in the room, this would be, you know, a nice topic to investigate. I think it's perhaps less of a concern for the extension of the Rome Like at Home scheme with Ukraine and Moldova, which will start on the 1st of January and which should be, you know, extended to all candidate countries. Kind of a no-brainer. Horizon, we kind of touched on Horizon Plus. Okay, it gets quite specific. With that, and 5 minutes into blessure overtime. I would like to thank you for your interventions, your questions, and of course, on your behalf, also warmly thank the panelists for their contributions. So please join me with an applause.